What if you found out that one of the most frequent reasons why people have abandoned their faith was itself looking very sketchy indeed? I'm talking about evolution and the consistent failure to verify its most important prediction, without which it is dead in the water, as it were. Hi, I'm Kirk, and I'm a scientist and a philosopher and a person who spends a lot of time thinking about the why questions in life. So if you're interested in discussions pertaining to God, science, and life, then please subscribe to my channel here, where I'll be posting on a regular basis. You can also subscribe to my social media accounts, and the links are below. In March of 2012, a rather shocking discovery was revealed in one of the most prestigious science journals in the world. In an article titled Raise Standards for Preclinical Cancer Research, it described how 53 landmark studies were examined to see if their findings could be reproduced or confirmed. Only 6 were confirmed. The remaining 89% failed. Even worse, the article went on to state that some of those non-reproducible preclinical papers had spawned an entire field with hundreds of secondary publications that expanded on elements of the original observation, but did not actually seek to confirm or falsify its fundamental basis. This highlights a very serious issue in science right now. There's another related massive failure in science looming on the horizon, and no one is talking about it. In one sense, it is too big to fail. I'm talking about Darwinism, specifically the Darwinian theory that the full diversity of life evolved from a single primitive cell. What exactly was it that effectively falsified those landmark papers I mentioned? It was the failure to reproduce those findings in the lab, simple as that. With that in mind, here is a very important question to think about. How was it that those papers got published in the first place and accepted by science committees, to the extent that in some cases they spawned an entire field of scientific study and research? The answer to that question is highly relevant to how Darwinism became accepted by science, despite the fact that, as I shall shortly discuss, it is consistently falsified in labs every day around the world. In short, those landmark papers that could not be reproduced were published, accepted, and launched fields of research simply because there was some evidence to support their conclusions, even though the conclusions now appear to be false. The problem was often in the interpretation of the data, as well as relying on earlier published papers that themselves could not be reproduced, to such an extent that you can have an entire field in science today that is essentially built on nothing but interpretation, and it all comes crashing down eventually when someone decides to try and reproduce those results. There's 2 takeaways here. First, you can have a lot of evidence for something in science, but that does not mean that the theory is true. The main deciding factor is whether or not its most important prediction can be tested and reproduced. Second, in science, the more the conclusions depend upon interpretation, inductive leaps, and creative storytelling, the more likely it is that there will be a problem when someone actually tries to reproduce those conclusions. This brings us to the elephant in the science room. There is no other area in modern science today that relies more heavily on interpretation, huge inductive leaps, and creative storytelling than the Darwinian theory that the full diversity of life has descended from a simple single cell hundreds of millions of years ago. That does not mean, however, that the conclusions of Darwinism are false. We must first test them. So take a look and see what happens when we do. But first, let's look at the evidence that supports it. First of all, there is data from the fossil record and from genetics that supports the idea, but, and this is a very big but, the Darwinian conclusions are very heavily dependent upon interpretation and inductive leaps. Furthermore, both the fossil record and genetics also provide data that pose serious problems for the Darwinian conclusions. When we think about this, What we actually need to do is to see what real-life biology and experimentation tell us. It turns out that we do find evidence for at least one important aspect of Darwinian theory: natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which plants or animals that are more fit for survival and reproduction will form a greater percentage of the population and pass their genes on more often. We also see evidence that random small changes, independent of natural selection, can also accumulate over time within a population of plants or animals. The bottom line is this: natural selection, along with random genetic changes, produce variation within a population over time. This actually is one of the definitions of evolution found in genetics textbooks, stated in a little simpler terms. So if we define evolution as the variation that occurs within a population of plants or animals as time goes on, then we must accept that this type of evolution is testable, reproducible, and verifiable. So what sort of question might you ask next when you consider the possibility that the full diversity of life has descended from a simple primitive cell? Obviously, if that's going to happen, then there must be no limits to this variation we have just discussed. This is what we call in science a testable prediction. In other words, we should be able to perform experiments to see if the ability for unlimited variation can be reproduced or observed. We can greatly accelerate evolution by speeding up the mutation rate and by guiding the evolutionary process in the lab. For example, an enormous amount of experimentation and guided selective breeding has been done in agriculture to enhance desirable characteristics in food crops and dairy production. So what happens when we test the central, fundamental, and essential prediction of Darwinism? The answer is that we consistently hit limits to variation beyond which further variation so badly reduces the fitness of the plant or animal that it cannot compete, reproduce, or survive. In more than a century, with thousands of scientists all over the world working in plant and animal science, we always hit limits to the amount of variation that can occur, no exceptions. One example is dog breeding. Through selective breeding to enhance certain characteristics, we have achieved an enormous variety of domestic dogs that millions of years of blind, unguided evolution may never have been able to accomplish. But we do hit limits, no matter what characteristic or what direction we attempt to extend that variation. It isn't because we run out of time to perform the experiment. Rather, an organism can only be modified to a limited extent before it can no longer be able to reproduce or survive. This falsifies the single most important prediction in Darwinism, specifically that there are no limits to how much a plant or animal can experience variation. Let's let this sink in for a moment. In the past century and a half since Darwin, actual attempts to verify the key prediction of Darwinian theory consistently failed to verify that prediction. This is the same problem we ran into with those other landmark studies that I spoke of earlier. I would go further than this. I would state, as a scientist who specializes in the area of genetic information and can explain exactly why there are limits to variation, that the idea that the full diversity of life descended from a simple cell is the most falsified theory in the history of science that still continues to be accepted anyway. So the question is, how can this be? I think the answer to that is nicely summed up in something that Jerry Fodor and Massimo Piatelli-Pulmoneri, themselves staunch Darwinists, wrote in an article in New Scientist. They wrote, "Much of the vast neo-Darwinian literature is distressingly uncritical. The possibility that anything is seriously amiss with Darwin's account of evolution is hardly considered. The methodological skepticism that characterizes most areas of scientific discourse seems strikingly absent when Darwinism is the topic." But it doesn't stop here. There is another key prediction that is being falsified. The DNA of every plant, animal, bacterium, and virus contains the genetic information or instructions required to build that organism. Craig Venter, the first scientist to decode the human genome, describes these genetic instructions or information as a very impressive system of computer programs. With this in mind, Another essential prediction of Darwinism is that the genetic information encoded in the genomes of life must have started at essentially zero information and over billions of years steadily increased to provide the instructions on how to build the full diversity of life we see today. In other words, on average, natural evolution must increase the amount of genetic information over time and generations to describe new life forms. This is essential. In fact, this is a key prediction that we can test. So the question is, what does the actual science tell us? According to Darwinism, the main way new genetic information is created is through mutations. Think of a mutation as randomly changing one letter in a tweet. But there is a problem which we can illustrate using the tweet example. Imagine that Twitter had an auto mistake feature that would randomly change letters each time your tweet was retweeted. Let's also say that Twitter had an autocorrect feature as well that would correct things it thought were mistakes. And we all know where that goes sometimes. Now let's imagine that the auto mistake feature added quite a few more mistakes than the autocorrect feature was able to fix with each retweet. The result is that your tweet would get messed up faster than it could get fixed up. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that after enough retweets, your tweet would have degenerated into utter nonsense. We have exactly the same problem in nature. Scientists observe that with each generation, new mutations appear in the genetic information of an animal. For example, we humans tend to accumulate about 90 mutations per generation. Think of a mutation as changing a letter in your tweet. The problem is, just like the tweet example, there are a lot more mutations that degrade the genetic information in the DNA of a plant or animal than mutations that correct or improve it. One does not need to be a rocket scientist to see that if this is the case, then mutations, which are supposed to be the key way evolution produces changes, are actually destroying the genetic information in all of biological life, not creating it. The information in our DNA is being messed up, so to speak, faster than it is being corrected or improved. For other examples, research has shown that this is happening in bacteria, the fruit fly, and in humans. So, what are the implications for Darwinism? Recall that the second key prediction of Darwinism is that, on average, the genetic information in the DNA of all life should be increasing over time. This is a testable, falsifiable conclusion. Modern science, however, confirms that nature is steadily destroying the genetic information in all of biological life over time, the exact opposite of what this essential prediction of Darwinism requires. So what can we take away from all of this? Recall all those peer-reviewed papers published in science journals that could not be reproduced? If the two most essential predictions of Darwinism are consistently falsified by modern science, then we must conclude that we have probably the biggest failure in modern science sitting right on our lap. The falsification of the Darwinian belief that the full diversity of life has been created by blind, natural processes which it turns out are steadily destroying the genetic information encoded in the DNA of life. There are implications, of course, that are highly relevant to those who have abandoned their faith because they believe that Darwinism was good science when, in fact, it now looks like it is in the same category of all those landmark science papers that could not be reproduced, some of which spawned whole areas of scientific study. All this raises another question. If natural processes such as mutations are slowly destroying the genetic information required for life, then where did the genetic information in the DNA of life come from? We'll explore that in my next video. Genetic information happens to be what my own research has specialized in. I'll leave you with a little teaser. When we examine the genetic information encoded in DNA, we find that the fingerprints of a superintelligence are all over the genomes of life. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it thought-provoking. And if you did, please share it, or you can leave a comment in the section below. And also, don't forget to hit the like button.